I was very pleased that Peter agreed to be the first contributor today, because in the fine Scottish tradition, you know, woods empower the gifty gie us to see ourselves as others see us, as Burns said. And Peter has been at the Chartered Institute since 2012, has a long record of working in these areas, and as I mentioned, has also taken a post at BPP, which is one of the interesting alternative providers, as they're called, although I think the language of that will evolve. So to start us off, Peter, over to you, and then we'll have a further contribution and some reflections, and then we'll open it up to a discussion.
Thank you, Neil.
Okay.
Here,
whichever you like, really.
well, we're a small
you're comfortable.
Group,
Yep.
but actually, why don't I just sit here? And I need to know which camera to look at.
It's all right. The camera up there, the best thing is just to look at the audience.
Kind of wave, I'll look at the audience. But a great pleasure to be here in Oxford. And thank you, Neil, for inviting me along. As you said, I've had a long interest in these sorts of subjects. I spent many years at Accenture, consulting with all sorts of businesses and sectors around the world. In the last 7 years I was there, I ran their global consulting business around people and talent and change management and leadership and all those sorts of incredibly important themes. Today, as you highlighted, through my work as the Chief Executive at the CIPD, I spend a lot of time with business schools. I talk at a lot of business schools. We accredit a lot of business schools' programs around HR management. I'm continuously trying to encourage business schools to think about the kind of people dimensions of business, because if I'm honest, I think historically we have not paid anything like enough attention to the people side of business. Now, why is that important? Why is it even more important that we do that? Well, just to take a brief step back and sort of think about where we are in the development of work and the kinds of skills that we're going to need in the future. I mean, I think have been observing, along with many others, that we're perhaps at a bit of an inflection point in business. Huge amount of things changing. Globalization in the economy, much more uncertainty everywhere we look. Brexit throwing a big spanner in the works as well. And in that world, you know, what becomes really important to business is agility and adaptability. It's no longer about, well, I can create a 20-year or 15-year or 5-year strategy. Yeah, direction I need to know where I'm going, but I've got to be able to adapt and I've got to be agile. And to do that, I've really got to engage my people, I've got to listen to my employees more, I've got to find innovation wherever it comes from and in my organizations. At the same time, demographics, Neil, you touched on younger generations and aspirations, expectations of younger generations. I mean, Gen Y was kind of studied to death, and I still get big reports telling me what Gen Y think about, and I think, hold on a second, we're probably, I don't know, 50%, certainly in the next 5 years, 10 years, 70% of the workforce will be Gen Y or younger. So whatever it was that Gen Y was bringing to the workforce is already happening, and indeed Gen Y have brought a lot of things to organizations, you know, different sense of things like purpose. I think corporate social responsibility has grown with a lot of impetus from younger generations saying, you know, we want businesses to be responsible. Business and working in business is not just about how much I get paid, it's about what I can contribute. And how does that business play its part in building better societies and communities? And thank goodness they're asking those kind of questions. So demographics is a big change, and now, of course, we're talking about Gen Z. I often talk about my own children. I've got 2 Gen Y daughters and a Gen Z daughter, and there's just definitely a difference with the Gen Z daughter. She is completely obsessed by technology. She suffers not only from FOMO. If any of you have got young children, you recognize what FOMO is, right? Which is? Fear of missing out. What's FOBO? Fear of being offline. Or, to extend the thought, so you've got generational changes, but to extend that thought of FOBO, the other big change that is driving our future is technology, and in particular things like artificial intelligence. So FOBO is also now being to describe fear of becoming obsolete. And it's somewhere in these august halls, I think it was from Oxford Business School, where Osborne and Frey, two academics, produced a very well-cited report working with Deloitte on the future of jobs, where they said that 47%, it was a very precise academic number, 47% of jobs that we do today could be automated in the next 10 years. And that what is really different about technology now from what we had in the past is it's no longer just about automation of processes and taking away administrative tasks. It's increasingly about high-skilled jobs and about high cognitive skilled jobs. So we end up increasingly looking at a future of work which is going to be very, very different. What jobs we all do, and you said, Neil, it's an increasingly important debate for governments and others. What are the jobs we're going to be doing in the future? Because if we don't understand that, then what skills we're building for? But it's very hard to determine. I mean, in my conversations with the government on this sort of thing, I say, when they say what jobs we're going to be in the future, what are we going to be doing? I say, I have no idea. But what I do know is they're going to be different from what we do today. And what that means in terms of skills, particularly job-related skills, is there is a stronger imperative for businesses to drive those kind of job skills, arguably than we've had in the past. And business, historically, I think has taken too much of a view that we need to be able to hire oven-ready employees straight out of business schools or out of university. And then we've had this long debate about so-called STEM skills, which is frankly a proxy for, for reducing the number of graduate applicants I have to find what I think I might need. I don't think it's just about STEM skills at all. If you look at some great work that the OECD did on this a number of years ago, they talked about the future of skills being very, very different things. The ability to, all this sort of critical thinking skills. You needed the great analysts, people who could take lots of different sources of information, make sense of it. The great communicators who could communicate ideas and share ideas and influence thinking because of that. The great localizers who could take lots of big ideas which might be relevant in other places and apply them in the context which is relevant to their business. In other words, what we're really starting to need to focus on are what some in the past have described more of the soft skills than the hard skills. And if the soft skills are about an ability to connect, to communicate, to collaborate, to share, to learn, and all those sorts of vital elements of what we need today and will need more of the future, then we need to think more about these soft skills than we have in the past. Another one I put on the table for you is resilience. We talk a lot now in a very fast-changing world with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things happening, and you've got to be able to experiment and take risks. And if you're not resilient and not prepared to confront failure along with success and treat those two imposters the same, whoever said that, somebody very learned will tell me, then you will not learn. I mean, we learn most from our mistakes. So resilience is a very important construct as well. So, as I said, when you look at a kind of future of work and you look at the kind of core skills that we need, then businesses have got to work more with academia and business schools in particular to say, okay, it may not be all the job skills, they're not sure what they're all going to be, but I can tell you what I will need, and I will need more of these kind of soft skills, critical thinking skills, project management skills, and all these other things. And I also want to see business leaders who are much better trained in what I started with, which is understanding people. There is no business that I'm aware of that doesn't employ, of any particular scale or size, that doesn't either employ people or have to interact with people, and yet somehow the paradigm of work over the last 20, 30, 40 years has been very much one of command and control, of process and of rules. As somebody said to me the other day, it's like we treated human beings as bad robots. In other words, we're going to design a process and we're going to put a human being in it and then we're going to write all these rules, because the problem is with human beings is they don't obey all the rules and they do have these things called behaviors, which are not always the things we want. Well, does that get the best out of people? Of course it doesn't. Does it engage them? Of course it doesn't. Does it create more stress in the workplace? Absolutely. Does it encourage things like voice and saying, all right, I've got some autonomy, I've got some say in what's going on here, and I will contribute as a result of that? And these are the kinds of paradigms that have to change in the world of work as well. And then finally, I think there's this other really, really important point, which is where and how we're going to be working. The growth of the so-called gig economy. I'm sure you've heard about that. Uberization is now a verb, I believe, in the Oxford English Dictionary, which says that people more and more are choosing different ways of working. So the old paradigm that said, it's okay, we're all going to join some big organization, that big organization will look after my training and skills development, because that's what big organizations do or should do. Well, if more of us are working for ourselves or in micro-enterprises where we do not have the resources or the focus or sometimes even the energy to say, well, I've got to train these people, or that these people who are working for me are contracted, so they are working literally on a gig, then where is the incentive for the employer to train these people? Which begs a very big question, which is who is going to train these people? So if people are moving around more between jobs, and those jobs themselves are changing, and we're going to be working longer, then there's a very big set of fundamental questions to be asked by government, by educationists, by business, we've got to think about welfare systems and a lot of other things that say, all right, so what are the support mechanisms for people that are moving between jobs, need to upskill and reskill, maybe not employed, but anybody's going to look after that skills development, and you move into ideas like the flex security models and other things which have been experimented with in other parts of Europe. So we are, as I briefly said, I think, at a real inflection point of thinking, and I passionately believe we're going to work on these agendas together. You know, the role of business schools in this, in helping to research and understand them at one level, these big trends and themes, and at another level, of course, helping us to build the kinds of skills, working more closely with businesses, to build the kind of skills we need, not just today, but in the future. And as I said, it's going to be much more about the soft skills than necessarily teaching me the details of financial management, which I don't deny is important, but I would also say, you know, we need to be teaching this stuff at school, and not having to pick it up at university and say, do you understand the basics of how a business runs? Isn't that a fundamental skill we should be teaching all our young people, particularly we're saying the growth of entrepreneurs and micro businesses, and most of them fail because they don't understand these things? So, as I said, my message would be, it's an extraordinary time, I think, to be in business. There is a lot changing, there's a lot of opportunity, but there are also a lot of threats. And our nation, and the productivity and competitiveness of our nation, depends on education and business working perhaps more closely together than they have in the past, but with a more fast-paced way of working, all the way from research through to what we teach and how business schools can help, not just with the entry level of graduates, but through the lifelong learning processes that we need so much more of, whether it be exec ed or anything else. And those, I think, are our agendas. And I applaud you, Neil, for pulling together events like this so we can debate these sorts of very broad-ranging themes.
Okay, so what I want to do is take some questions and queries to Peter and some discussion around that before we go on to Roxanne. Can I ask you one question? In a number of discussions that I've had with senior HR and development people, there is now a body of opinion that says that they can identify the talent at 18 and would rather engage with the talent at 18 than run the risk of waiting for them to be spoiled.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are employers who are taking that attitude, and it seems that some of the levy reforms might open that up more. But have you got a comment on that point of view?
I have, Neil, because there's a contrary point of view that says for many employers 18 is too young. It's interesting, we are, and the levy is going to drive more of this, of course, a lot more businesses encouraging or creating apprenticeship programs. Interestingly, not just at entry level, but right through. But if I take the entry level challenge, then a lot of businesses saying, yeah, but the problem is when I get an 18-year-old, they often really are lacking these core employability skills. And although it's frankly, for many people, a very expensive way to build employability skills if you're not sure what you're going to do, to go to university and build up what is now one of the biggest debts of young people in any developed nation. For businesses, they find often there's quite a risk in taking an 18-year-old. And hence, in part, I think, and partly also because of the arguably oversupply of graduates, it's been a lot easier for business to say, you know what, I'd rather have a graduate, or I'd rather have an Eastern European worker who might be 24, who's got probably not just 1 degree, but 2 degrees, who's come to the UK to work here hard, to earn some money to send back home, and is just going to get on with the job. And so, but there are lots of dynamics to this whole point as well, because we might get into this kind of mismatch of qualifications of the workforce and the nature of work, because it's one of the big drivers of productivity. But it's not to shine or point the finger at education and say, well, you got it all wrong, because business itself has not invested enough in training and developing people. It's taken these very broad-based views of how to recruit people, saying, I'd rather just have a graduate or a STEM skill, versus saying, no, you know what, an 18-year-old who comes in with some of these basic attributes, who's got a good attitude to work, who I put in an apprenticeship, will actually then learn the skills I need and is much more likely, interestingly, to stay with that job than say, well, I'm a graduate, I'll do that for a year, but then I want your job, right? And I'll give you some examples of this. The BBC really were dragged kicking and screaming by the previous HR director into the idea that they should have apprenticeships. The BBC was not a traditional 18-year-old employer. Not only did it like graduates, it particularly liked Oxbridge graduates. And it really wasn't very good, despite the nature of being a media broadcaster where you would think, diversity is an important thing, an attribute of its own workforce. It wasn't very good at this stuff. So then they started to recruit 18-year-old graduates, and they placed them in some of the departments, and then the department heads, after about 6 months, started saying, you know what, I want more of these 18-year-olds, because they come in here, they don't have a big attitude, they just want to get on and learn, they are grateful for the opportunity, and they are loyal to a fault in terms of sticking with me and the things I ask them to do. So, as I said, you can look at this from kind of two ways, can't you? You can look at it from, I think there's a great opportunity and benefit to apprenticeship programs that bring 18-year-olds into work, but we have to recognize sometimes warts and all. And from the other side, I think we've got to get businesses still to open up their minds, to recognize that that is a good route for people into work. They need to be encouraging it. The levy's going to make them do more of this stuff, and I think the outcome could be quite positive if we get it right.
Okay, comments and questions on what Peter's had to say? There are microphones, and if you could say who you are and...
Thank you very much for this good introduction. My name is Olivier Brenningmeier. You mentioned two skills, or one fear and one skill. The skill you mentioned is resilience, to which I fully agree is terribly needed. But young people have a fear of missing out, or a fear of being left online. Yeah. Isn't that actually a contradiction? The fears cancel out the ability to be resilient.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think, yes, you can absolutely look at things like this, and a lot of more research emerging on the Gen Zs, the digital natives, how being in an online world is affecting their thinking, are they becoming more risk averse? There was some very interesting research in Sweden, which was quite disturbing, about the levels of depression amongst young people, because they're trying to present through social media this wonderful world they live in, their wonderful lives. And therefore, anything that is a threat to that, they tend to distance themselves. I mean, even going back to the Students' Union, the NUS, the debates going on in Oxford about rejecting, some of the things of the past, like, statues of Cecil Rhodes. There's a lot of debate about, are young people just growing up in a world where they want to isolate themselves from a lot of reality and kind of reposition a world that works for them. And it's a debate that will continue, but I think that, combined with what for many has been a trend in education, where we're not allowed to say that somebody's failed and they've got to get it right before they can progress, is also a perception a lot of people have in business. So how you teach resilience is a really, really interesting question. But I am seeing, I'm taught the head teachers too, and I'm seeing this coming onto the agenda of schools more. We've got to teach our children about failure, what it means to fail. It's not the end of the world. If you can learn from it, you've got to pick yourself up and move on. But I think, we would both agree, in a world that is changing so rapidly, we have to understand what may be making young people less resilient, or maybe they're just coming into a world which it has got so much change that their level of resilience has to be higher than previous generations. But whatever it is, I think it's a very, very fundamental skill. We cannot have people so stressed out, as some of these studies are showing, that they're rejecting things that they can't understand or not part of their convenient world view, and then get into the world of work and find it's all different. Okay. And that's a very challenging question for us.
Okay. Mike, if you can say where you're from as well.
Sure. Mike Molan, I'm the Dean of the Business School at London South Bank. I just wanted to go back to the issue of apprenticeships, because I'm sure we've all been through various incarnations of employer engagement and attempts to get better links between universities and businesses. There's a serious plan and serious money behind apprenticeships now, so I think this is likely to go further. But I just wondered what the thinking was around the extent to which there is still a bit of snobbery and prejudice around the idea of apprenticeship. And I'm old enough to sort of remember, grammar schools and secondary moderns, and boys who were good with their hands went to the secondary modern. And what are the chances of us shaking off this idea that apprenticeships are for also-rans, and the extent to which 18-year-olds will see it as actually not like going to uni, and therefore the thing is kind of stillborn?
Very, very important questions, Mike. I mean, if you look at the trend over the last, whatever it's been, 20, 30 years in terms of apprenticeships, we've dropped off on apprenticeships. We weren't bad, but not as good as many of our continental cousins. But it's dropped off significantly, and now we're trying to reverse that trend. And it's in the teeth of It started with Tony Blair and his mantra of education, 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 that we should have half our young people going to university, which is pretty much where we're at. We're very close to it. And now you've then got a perception all the way from schools and school teachers that says success is about going to university, for parents saying success is about going to university, and for young people saying success is about going to university. And that whether it's apprenticeship or anything else, somehow if I don't do that, then where am I? So you got that, as you said, a kind of cultural backdrop, which we really have to work very, very hard to overcome. What the government's been doing, so it's talking about this 3 million target. There's a huge danger it just becomes quantity versus quality. We can already see a massive growth of level 2 apprenticeships. Well, how's that going to help? Unless we can show, certainly if you want to contrast with university education, that you can really see progression to an apprenticeship up through higher and advanced levels of apprenticeship with the potential crossover into academic qualification, if that's what I want, which is what happens in Germany and many other countries. We have two systems that really do fight each other in this country in terms of QAA and QCF and all these sorts of other mechanisms. So all the way, as you said, from how do we shift the rhetoric through schools, from primary age probably onwards, through parents in a wider cultural discourse or societal discourse about different routes into work, the validity of these different routes of work, through to being able to really show that in the apprenticeship system, both through how it works with business schools, how it works with businesses, that you can show progression, and that we do not end up, which is a huge danger, the unintended consequence of this apprenticeship label, we've done quite a lot of research on it, is that it'll be a flight to quantity, and businesses, rather than creating new opportunities, simply rebadging what they already do. And we can already see it happening. So you've got that concern as well, so that hardly opens up new opportunities. And as I said, this lack of really understanding progression on apprenticeships. And I think, I'm sure a number of you from universities here are working on these ideas of degree apprenticeships, which are really, really important, and I think could work well, because that shows, again, the progression, then the crossover into more academic qualification, if that's what you want to accomplish, but that we've got to find a more flexible way of doing that. It can't be, well, I did my level 5 or level 6, and now I've got to do a full degree. How do we make those two systems work together? And I think it's as much up to us as any regulator, frankly, to figure that out.
Malcolm?
Malcolm Gillies, a retired gentleman. The way you're describing this issue still has something of the ring of the old nation state in a world of increasing mobility and a world when a lot of people want to come to Britain. That's what Amber Rudd is talking about in France in these days. Isn't it a better business deal, I mean, just in how you spend money, to enhance the migration you've just praised with those Eastern European people with the qualifications, the experience and the attitude, and not worry so much about spending 5 or 10 years of training a local population when that will cost so much more and in fact cost them so much more?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Michael. I've worked a lot with, as my time as consultant, with lots of different businesses, looking at maps of the world where you can find talent. Most businesses really are not looking at geographic boundaries. They're just saying, look, if I can access good talent in this country, I will locate myself here and I will access that talent. We all know, we've seen from endless numbers of surveys that over the last years that CEOs and businesses are worrying more and more about access to skills as their primary thing. If I can't get the people, then I'm in trouble. So, yes, I think you could take a much more pluralistic, global view of the world and say, you know what, if this country can be competitive and successful and attract good people, which it's historically been able to do, I'm a massive believer in diversity. That's where innovation comes from, all these other things. And if we can continue to attract good people, good skills, what's wrong with that? There is the debate, as you know, which has come a lot through some of the Brexit discussions, about are these migrant workers competing against Brits for the same jobs? And the evidence of that is not particularly overwhelming that they are. I mean, at one level, there are, sad to say, a lot of jobs that migrant workers seem to be prepared to do that Brits aren't. And I'm not just talking about fruit pickers in East Anglia. You go talk to logistics companies. They can't hire truck drivers. Go to the construction industry. They can't hire, there aren't enough young people wanting to do traditional trades. Yeah, I mean, honestly, if I was starting out today, I could have a £40,000 debt by going to university, or I could become a plumber, and now I have a job for life. So, but I think the bias, again, to go back to the point about young people and what they're being encouraged to do from school on, the bias towards university has also deflected them away from these kinds of jobs. And then giving them an expectation, you know what, you're a graduate, you should come into a graduate job. Research we did last year as the CIPD suggested almost 60% of graduates in this country are doing not graduate jobs. And I'm being very careful in my definition here, because we are today defining, and businesses have defined many jobs as graduate jobs, where you don't really need to be a graduate. It's just because that's back to the earlier point about recruiting 18-year-olds. It's easier, and there are a lot of them, to recruit a 21-year-old graduate, whether the job requires a graduate or not. So I think your wider point is an interesting one. We're going to see this debate run and run, as you know. I was listening to Theresa May was at Chequers today, first time after the summer recess, trying to figure out what the hell they all meant by Brexit. Brexit means Brexit, yeah, but what does Brexit mean? And the big debate at the heart of it, I think most people are concluding, is migration. But that is I think it's been a very distorted view of what we think about migration. The reality is that the majority of migrants into this country are not coming from the EU, and most of the EU migrants are generally helping businesses to do what they need to do.
I mean, there's no doubt the European pool has worked extremely well for UK business. It's this big issue of those left behind. And even in the 1990s, people like Patricia Hewitt at the IPPR were writing about the dangers for young white males who had no qualifications. Yeah. But they were absorbed into the Blair boom economy that went right up until the banks crashed. And really, the Labour government didn't address that side of it. Tomlinson and diplomas were an attempt, but they ran up against their own kind of university snobbery. But now those that have left behind have had the revenge. So the political classes know that they have to address this. Yeah. And I think the levy is part of that. And Heseltine and others have always been very strong on it. But it does need to be able to reach up into colleges and things a bit more, if I may say, in the Scottish tradition of the further education colleges and the people who are working at non-university level, which has a slightly stronger tradition and respect. And I think that's quite interesting.
Yes, and so just briefly on that point, Neil, and in the Scottish system, I think less early specialisation. We force people in the English system to specialise so early when they're so young. And that's why I was emphasising this point about these core skills. We need much more of them, and worrying less about whether I got 3 A levels in some very specific subjects, which I may or may not take forwards into my future career.
Okay. Other comments and feedback? A question, maybe actually, Mike, since I know that you're a business dean. When I was working for the Association of Business Schools, and the MBAs were growing like topsy, one of the statistics that completely took me by surprise was that 86% of the full-time MBAs being studied at UK business schools were being studied by overseas students. And that when you looked behind it, you could see that UK business had been disconnecting from business schools, either because they wouldn't pay for it or the time off, etc., was inflexible. And they were investing in lots of shorter private courses, often run by their own academics, by the way, as far as I could see. But also you began to see the problems arising in part-time education in Birkbeck and some of the Open Universities models. Just that point about, where is that disconnect? Do you have any sort of insight into it?
I think there's a couple of issues there. One is, to put it bluntly, that MBAs taken by overseas students is a really good money spinner for universities. And there's been a little bit of a race to the bottom in terms of entry requirements, in the sense that you have non-executive MBAs that are taken by people straight off degrees. And we could argue for a long time about the validity of that, but money is money, and money talks. The changes that the QAA have now made will put a stop to that, and that's going to be challenging, I think, to the business model for a lot of universities who've relied on that income. So that the home market, certainly for us, has tended to be part-time. And I think there's a bigger question there, and I don't want to preempt too much what we might discuss after the break, but as a relatively new, very new business dean, looking at this with new eyes, I simply said, what's the point of an MBA? Okay, and others may shoot me down for saying this, but it had slightly the whiff of supply-side economics about it. We'll teach you what we know, and we hope that you'll want it, and we hope that employers will find it useful. And I think the disconnect, in my view, has been a failure to stand outside the institution and say, what's the point of it? Why would somebody employ you with this qualification? What value are you going to add to the organisation? And I think there's been a little too much of putting a trophy on the mantelpiece and hoping that it makes you more employable. And I think there's going to be a kind of relearning curve for some organisations. They're going to have to rethink their MBA business. And that's why we're hearing, you know, in terms of some of the commentators, the idea that the MBA is dead. Well, it probably isn't, but it needs to be something completely different if it's going to survive.
Yeah, I was reading some interesting stats. As you said, a vast number of overseas students doing MBAs in this country. But yeah, I mean, I've reflected on myself in business. I remember asking my employer, Accenture, when I was, I don't know, 25, 26, something like that. So I've been in business 3 or 4 years, said, would you sponsor me to do an MBA? And they said, no. I said, why would we? We will train you to do everything you need to know. It adds no value, further value to us. I think, however, you know, interestingly, as I talk to people who've done MBAs, a lot of them would say, well, I've done an MBA in order to make a career change. So the classic is I've worked in a particular functional field of business, and I want to go, for example, I want to go and be a consultant, or I want to go into investment banking or something like that. So some people have unquestionably looked at the MBA as their ticket to make a significant career shift. Now, whether that plays out, to your point, in reality or not is an interesting question, but I think there's some evidence of that. I also read a very interesting stat that said that 31% of global chief executives of the world's largest companies, the world's 500 largest companies, have done an MBA. Now take that for what you will. Interestingly, they were very largely from the top business schools. And that's another thing. I mean, I think it is a challenge. You know, I know I'm a big fan of schools like yours. My youngest daughter's just starting off at Oxford Brookes. I'm a big fan of that model. But I think when it comes to MBAs, it's a tight market, and everybody knows the ladders, the Harvards, the LBSs, you know, and big businesses would say, you better have got a big business degree, as it were. And that was what was evidenced by this research on chief execs. They pretty much all have come from the top 10 schools. Now, do we all need MBAs to be chief execs of large Fortune 500 companies? Well, probably not. Secondly, do we all want to be chief executives for Fortune 500 companies, or could be? No, of course not. So yeah, I think it's time to challenge some of these constructs. So what's the purpose of an MBA? From a business perspective, it's a very, very thin case whether I would sponsor it or whether I would recruit an MBA, because part of the problem, as I touched on before, is you bring in an MBA and they think they know it all. They really do. It's a bit like, you know, computer science graduates. I don't know if you're teaching computer science courses, but they come into the big tech companies, and then the tech companies say, I'm not really sure I want to hire computer science graduates because they think they know it all. And unfortunately, what they've been taught at university is out of date, because computer science of all subjects is changing so rapidly. So there's that kind of debate as well.
Okay. Before we go to our next speaker, just one, is there anyone here from further education? Because it's worth remembering that 11%, I think it is, of degrees are taught in further education colleges. A large number of them are very business focused and often perhaps more granular than in some of the universities. And I thought it was interesting that one of the first degree apprenticeships that was done was at Durham, and all the newspapers wrote it assuming it must be Durham University, when it's not. It's New College Durham, and John Widdowson will be here tomorrow. But that further education element, as the other providers, a lot of whom have kept quite close contacts with their businesses and things. Anybody, and we're aware that some universities are reviewing their franchising relationships with further education in a not very attractive fashion. Not quite monopolistic or cartel, but, you know, regarding it as competition locally. And that seems to be a big issue that will come up. Has anybody got further education point of view that they would like to stick in as one of the key alternative providers to universities, if you like, if not the key?
So hi, I'm Ramita Teshpal. I'm from Bromley College. We recently merged with Bexley in Greenwich, and now we are London Southeast College. And yes, you're right that we do deliver business courses, and we deliver it with franchise with University of Greenwich and Canterbury Christ Church University. But again, I think we struggle with the bachelor's model, because there's a 3-year model we deliver, and also the foundation degrees. Our foundation degrees do really well because there's a mature market we appeal to. But again, and further education colleges struggle with selling the BSc Business Honors courses, for example, because universities do want to charge the same fee, which is 9,000, and sometimes learners don't feel the same value. Like you said earlier, that it's all about the value. Why would they pay £9,000 and come to a further education college to get their business degree? And again, the further education as managing the business school for the last 3 years, I struggle with that some universities, for example, Canterbury, they have written the business course, and there's very much less we can do. It's very much driven to that target market of 18 to 21, but we have mature students who come to the business course who already have experience in business, and we can't really play with the program a lot or change it. So I think there's need for the education, to kind of step up and have that voice in the association of business, that we can write or rewrite the business model for further education in that mature market who wants to come into business degrees or want to do the degree apprenticeships, for example. So, for example, we bid it for our degree apprenticeships bid. So we will be working towards developing that as well. So yeah.
And have you looked at all at getting your own degree awarding powers? Because one of the fascinating things about the past 5 years is that, whatever it is, Clause 157, that would have enabled some further education colleges and others to step up and achieve university status, but they've chosen not to in most cases.
Yeah. I think the same, for the past 20 years, they've chosen not to, because some programs, if you go quality assured, where we had direct numbers, the numbers dropped drastically because we were helped by the university marketing machine. So we saw drastic, so we were thinking that would that help us to have our own degree awarded by our college? Would that have the same value for the learners? But we're trying to get our FTAP powers first. So yeah, and then think of degree awarding powers. But again, it goes back to, will that give students the value? And would they see value in it?
Very interesting,
Yeah.
the marketing power of universities.